St. Mark's Cathedral acknowledges that we gather on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people who are still here, and we honor with gratitude the land itself and the life of all the Coast Salish tribes. So Edie, would you please offer the opening prayer?
Yeah. I chose our prayer for tonight from a volume by John Philip Newell called Praying with the Earth, a Prayer Book for Peace. And I chose this particular one, which happens to go with Tuesday evening, and it's a prayer for the life of the world. All things are born of you, O God. We carry within us your light and your life. In the mystery of matter and deep in the cells of our souls are your longings for oneness. The oneness of the universe vast and vibrating with the sound of its beginning. The oneness of the earth greening and teeming as a single body. The oneness of the human soul, a sacred countenance in infinite form. Grant us your longings for oneness, O God, amidst life's glorious multiplicities. Gracious and holy God, you have given us the gift of this day in which we now come together in a spirit of oneness and of commitment as stewards of your creation. We ask that you continue to stir up within us a desire to learn, a desire to work together, a desire to work for the good of all creation. Open our ears and our minds and our hearts and our hands this night and beyond, that we may act in service to you with love and justice. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Edie.
I just will say a few words about Andrew's background. I couldn't begin to go through all the items that are in his resume, which I have not looked at, but I know he's an author, sort of the Lord, which explores the roots of fundamentalism in an American family. And it's his American family going back, what, 3 generations or 4 generations? Yes.
Wow.
And has an introduction to by Parker Palmer.
Oh, I didn't know.
Also, so that is one of his published things. He has spoken on TED Talks also about this particular topic of carbon neutrality and sustainability. He's a cyclist. I think, are you still cycling across town a lot?
Absolutely.
All right, good. And at St. Mark's, he was a member of the vestry, and when on the vestry, he was one of the early outspoken advocates for sustainability and reduction of carbon by measuring what it was and then being able to measure our reduction of our carbon emissions. I remember also knowing that he and another parishioner, Penelope Jackson, had prepared a presentation for one of those groups I don't know anything about, the Diocesan Council, I guess. I think it's our governing body way up there. And they talked about, they approached the whole issue of sustainability from 2 different perspectives. So he has a deep history with us. He has been part of our group. I remember him cycling up to a 7:30 meeting one morning that we could talk about next things. So in this idea of collective action, so that we can see that there's work going on that is beyond us. I think his new title of being Director of Collective Impact at the UW helps us understand that there are initiatives that are being developed and addressed for how this can happen in the built environment. So welcome, and thank you so much for joining us tonight, Andrew.
Thank you. I'm really, really happy to be here. And it really does feel like coming home to being at St. Mark's tonight. It's really great to see all of you. So I'm gonna actually, my screen says unmute yourself. I'm not going to do that because you already have a mic over there. And I'm going to pay no attention whatsoever to Zoom, which is giving me instructions about this. I don't follow the instructions of every machine who tells me to do something. So I want to start out by actually saying something that I think is perhaps a little bit counterintuitive. And that is that hope is overrated. Hope is overrated. So most of us, I think, when we think about hope, we think, well, hope is the basis for action. We have to have hope or we won't act. If there's no hope, we won't act. And I want us tonight to consider turning that upside down. Actually, what if it were possible to imagine that acting is the way that we create the basis for hope? So I also want to quote from the Creation Care Ministries statement on the website, on St. Mark's website, because I think it's a great one. And that mission, or that first introductory paragraph, says, as stewards of the life-giving goodness of God's creation, we will work with St. Mark's and broader world communities to educate and take action together to preserve our shared planet and sustain life for the generations to come. Through engaging in collective action that makes an effective impact, we will grow into the joy of transcending our fears and sense of powerlessness around the issue of climate change. The focus is about action. What are we going to do, right? So I also want to kind of make a reference to philosophy and a way of thinking about the world that I encountered probably 25 years ago. And it's a theory called, or an approach called appreciative inquiry. If you Google appreciative inquiry, you'll find about 10,000 web pages about it. It's essentially this idea that if you actually want to make a big positive difference in the world or in any individual situation, you don't start out by saying, what's the problem and how are we going to solve it? You start out by saying, what's the challenge? And then what are all the gifts and strengths and possibilities? What is the potential in the system, including both people and relationships and even the physical objects in the environment? What are all the positive characteristics of that environment that allow us to depend on them to create a solution that is transformative? So the thing is that a lot of surveys show that when people read stories about climate disaster, the typical response is, hey, somebody ought to do something about that, right? It's a terrible problem. Somebody ought to do something about it. But when people read stories about innovative or inspiring solutions, people are far more likely to say, wow, that's amazing. I wonder how I could be part of it. So it seems to me that there are three types of stories that we tell ourselves about climate change. One is a story that is about a dystopia. Like, we are all just totally screwed up. You know, the planet is doomed. We're all, well, I was about to say, use the F word, but I won't. We're in a church, for goodness sake. So, yeah, we're being recorded. I don't want to be recorded saying that, but so we're just really screwed. We've got a horrible situation. It's getting worse. It's systemic. What in the hell are we going to do about it? And that's a dystopia. It's a story of failure and defeat and ultimately depression and despair. And another type of story that people could tell is a utopian story. And a utopian story might be, what if we lived in a world that was imaginary and perfect? What if we lived in a world where all of this stuff and alternate reality were true and we didn't have to confront the one that we're in? That's a great act of the imagination, but not necessarily a guide for action in this world, right? And a third type of story that we could tell ourselves is what I would think of as a realtopia. Was essentially a realtopia is a story that recognizes not only the world as it is, but also the world that it could be, based on the world that it is today and how there are components or features or aspects of the world that we live in that could be relied on to help us transform the world that we live in, right? So now I'll tell you a realtopia story about a concept known as embodied carbon. And I hate to use a term like that almost because it's like, that's really wonky and who's going to know what the hell that is? But I also kind of like the term because the word embodied carbon, in some sense, all of us, every human being, every living being is embodied carbon. We are all embodied carbon. In the sense that I'm speaking about it, though, embodied carbon is essentially a bookkeeping term. So if you go back 35 to 40 years to the very inception of what we think of as the green building movement, then the definition of a green building was one that was very, very careful about the way that it used energy, right? A green building was a highly efficient building that was energy efficient. And so for most of the last 35 years, that's been the definition of the term. But that definition only took into account what we call operational energy. Energy, or rather operational carbon is energy. And if you're reducing operational carbon, then you're reducing the amount of energy that you're using. So the story of my first introduction to this term embodied carbon was literally, it was 7 years ago. I'm not from the building industry. I never even graduated from college of any kind. I went to a couple of colleges and either they threw me out or I withdrew before they could. But I didn't have the technical expertise to understand the term even, but I was at a meeting at the University of Washington and a bunch of scientists and researchers were in the room and we all went around the table and said, well, why are you here? And my answer was, well, I'm here because I want to, it feels to me like the most significant social justice issue in the world is climate change. And I'd like to figure out a way to address that challenge, but I don't know how. And it feels to me that there needs to be some kind of business related solution to climate change. If it's not related to the way the economy works, it doesn't matter to the long-term vision of a solved problem. So I'm interested in how do we get carbon out of the atmosphere or stop it from too much carbon from going into the atmosphere? How do we then take that carbon and do something useful with it? Perhaps put it into some material made out of carbon that could go into a product that could be sold into a market. How do we even think about that? One of the people in the room was a woman named Kate Simonin, who's a professor of architecture and engineering at the university. And when it came around to Kate, she looked across the room at me and she said, are you aware that the biggest products on the planet are buildings? And did you know that the manufacture of buildings is one of the most significant causes of carbon emissions? And I said, well, no, I had no idea. I had never heard of that idea before. So that was kind of, that moment changed my life. It was like, oh my God, if that's true, I got to learn a lot more about this. So 7 years ago, the Carbon Leadership Forum it had no budget, it had no paid staff. It was just Kate and a part-time graduate student and who were involved in a series of conversations with a lot of other carbon nerds, people who are really interested in the technical details of how you understand the problem of embodied carbon in the building industry. And in the industry, nobody knew what we were talking about. Nobody knew what embodied carbon was. It wasn't a topic that anybody knew about. There were no tools to measure it. There were no policies to address it. There was no action going on to directly address embodied carbon. So what's happened, though, is consequent on the scale of the problem or the scale of the challenge. And the challenge is that when you look at all greenhouse gas emissions, when you look at all of the carbon emissions associated with extracting materials from the ground, manufacturing them into useful products, transporting those materials to a job site, putting them together into the shape of a building, all of that has to do, that's what embodied carbon is. It's the bookkeeping term that we use to describe that whole packet of carbon emissions. And unless you do that calculation, you don't know what the problem is. The scale of the problem is that over the next 40 years, we'll be building another 2 trillion square feet of building space in the world. That's a big number. What it means is that every 35 days for 40 years, we'll be building the equivalent of a new New York City, all 5 boroughs. Every 35 days for 40 years. The other interesting thing to know is that when you think about the lifetime carbon emissions associated with creating, building, constructing, and then using a building over 80 years, approximately half of the carbon emissions, the lifetime carbon emissions for that new building are in its operation, and about half are in embodied carbon. Which also means that almost all embodied carbon emissions are created before anybody enters the door on the first day of its habitation or use. And that also means that if you want to meet a climate target of 2030 for net zero carbon emissions, you have to pay big attention to embodied carbon. And the other thing to understand is that building materials are an extremely significant component of the total carbon emissions on the planet. Just 2 materials, steel and cement, are responsible between them for 15% of all greenhouse gas emissions, which is more than agriculture, and almost as much as global transportation, including all of the cars on the road and all the airplanes in the sky and all the trains on tracks and all the rest of it. That's how significant the challenge is. But there are really big solutions in play now, and over the last 5, 6, 7 years, there's been a transformation in the building industry, which means that today, there is a radical shift in global consciousness of embodied carbon. And this is the #1 topic for conversation around the world in the building industry.
Okay, cool.
So the solutions involve new materials that either replace or dramatically alter the materials that we have today, new ways of making old materials like cement and steel, for example. And just as an example, I know of at least a dozen companies that are making net zero carbon, completely free of carbon emissions, cement. But the old way of making cement, when you made 1 ton of Portland cement, you'd also release 1 ton of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, right? So now taking that process and changing it so that you're releasing no carbon into the atmosphere is really important. It's really significant and highly unusual to think about. But it also means that there are new ways of making materials that actually, on balance, store carbon in buildings and in materials that you make buildings out of, instead of emitting carbon in the manufacture and construction of buildings, right? So a third way to really reduce this problem is to create buildings that have a new design, that don't use nearly as much material as they used to, and do the same job, or just as strong, just as viable, just as have structural integrity and all the rest of it, but use a lot less cement or steel or any number of other materials. And finally, people are beginning to get the idea you don't have to tear that building down. You can recycle it, you can rebuild it, you can adapt it for other purposes. And that's also an incredible, the building in the world that has the least amount of embodied carbon, the lowest embodied carbon footprint, is the one that already has been built. And you didn't tear it down to create a new building in its place. So several years ago, I'm basically saying before the pandemic, the pandemic changed so many things, not in our consciousness and our behavior, and in this problem as well. And so the theory of change that we began to develop before the pandemic was, if you want to fundamentally alter the conditions of the world, that lead to this problem, you need to do three things. All three of them are significant. The first is you have to have data to be able to report on the problem accurately and scientifically. You have to have tools in the hands. This is still part of part one. You have to have tools in the hands of building designers, including architects and engineers, for example, who can then make decisions about, I want to procure a low carbon material for that part of my building or that part of my bridge or roadway. Secondly, the market, the capitalist economy and the market by itself does not solve the problem. You have to have government policy at all levels that drives transformative change. And that means voters have to understand what's going on. Their representatives have to be clued in, and everybody has across the industry has to be really deeply understanding and welcoming policy changes that shift change in the industry. And finally, collective action. It can't just be a few people thinking about this or handing down some edicts from on high. It has to be everybody across the industry. It means real estate investors. It means companies that own buildings. It means architects. It means engineers. It means policymakers. It means voters. It means people at school board meetings and people on corporate campuses. Everybody has to be engaged in it. It's like the world's biggest community organizing project. And that's part of my job. That's why I was hard to help to do this. So there has been dramatic evidence of change over the last 5, 6, 7 years. For one thing, when I met Kate, I think she had one half-time graduate student helping her on a part-time basis. And today we've got 20 full-time employees at the university. It's a topic for discussion. Like I said, I mean, it's literally 5, 6 years ago. One of the things that I did on a daily basis was I Googled, like, are there any mentions of embodied carbon anywhere in the world in any publication? And maybe once a week I'd come up with like one thing, and I'd grab it and I'd put a link to it on the website, right? And today, if you Google or search for embodied carbon, there are thousands of entries. And every single day, there are a whole bunch of new articles or new announcements or whatever related to embodied carbon. Tools and data. The way that you have to report the reality of embodied carbon is you're a material manufacturer, and you create what's called an environmental product declaration, or an EPD, which is a third-party verified, scientifically valid way of reporting on the carbon footprint of this material created in this factory in that part of the world. And then you have to make that available publicly so that anybody can look at it. And that is a file that it used to be just a PDF file that's printed on a piece of paper or sent as an email attachment. Nowadays, you can actually create a digital EPD that goes into a big database that has 200,000 other EPDs in it, and a building designer can use a tool that we developed. It's called EC3. I won't even tell you what the acronym stands for. Well, it's Embodied Carbon and Construction Calculator. And you, as a building designer, you can use that tool to compare all of these products from a whole bunch of different companies and decide, I'm going to buy from that company because they have the lowest carbon footprint of the product, right? And it could be cement or steel or insulation or glass or aluminum or doors or, the light bulb, whatever it is. They're all going to be in that database. Increasing, they're not all in that database, and we've got a ways to go. But today, there are 50,000 building designers using that tool, and there are something over 200,000 EPDs in the database.
Is that in the US or around the world?
That's around the world. It's mainly in the US, but I want to tell you about another reason I'm really hopeful, which is that around the world, people are beginning to think about, well, how do we get the data? What is the data? What's the database that we're using? And that leads to another acronym that I'm just going to tell you because I can't help it. I love this acronym. And yes, it's kind of nerdy, but the acronym is the Embodied Carbon Harmonization Embodied Carbon Harmonization and Optimization Project, ECHO, right? Isn't that great? So what is ECHO? So Jim, you're laughing. I love it.
We do this stuff all the time.
I know. Well, you can remember the word echo. You can't remember all the rest of the gobbledygook, right? But so here's the challenge. We heard from a bunch of people in the real estate industry that, yeah, real estate investors care about the climate. They want to do something about it. But, you know, if you're commissioning a project, you know, it's for example, several years ago, Microsoft had a project to build rebuild the campus in Redmond, Washington with 17 new buildings, $8.3 billion building project. And they wanted to know, well, you know, what is embodied carbon after they heard about it from one of the people in our network. And so we were able to say, well, here's what embodied carbon is, and here's how you report it. Well, there wasn't a lot of ways to report it. They helped us to make the demand on the building industry to report EPDs for every material that went into their project. But if you're a real estate investor and you want to make a difference, how do you know who to talk to or what data to listen to? And so there are all these certification programs for green buildings. There's the LEED system you've probably heard about. LEED is the certification program hosted by the U.S. Green Building Council. And it's what most people have heard of before. It's mainly been about energy in the past, but now it's becoming about embodied carbon as well. And so there's the LEED program. Here in Seattle, there's the International Living Buildings Institute. And they've got the Living Future or the Living Buildings Challenge. And then there's the Structural Engineers 2050 Challenge to get to net zero. And I could name about 15 others that I won't, I promise. But there are all of these. There's a contractor's commitment. There's a mechanical, electrical and plumbing engineers commitment. There's a landscape designer commitment. There, all these people in the building industry, they all want to go to the right place, but they're all reporting their data in different ways through different databases using different reporting tools. And if you're a real estate investor, all you want to do is do something good. You don't know who to talk to or how to report your data or how to make decisions. So ECHO is a project to bring all of those organizations together in one room, in one place, and we're going to agree to report our data in exactly the same way, using the same data structures to the same database, maybe even using the same reporting tool. And that means any real estate investor, advisor, or executive will be able to say, I get it. So I'll just take one set of numbers. It's all consistent with global climate change and with a way to address that problem. And I'll know that I can make a difference if I make this kind of decision.
It's a standardization.
It's a complete standardization, first of all, in the United States, but we're already having conversations globally with everybody else in the world who's thinking about this. And our objective within the next 1 to 2 years is we'll have a common global standard for all of this stuff, right? Which is kind of amazing.
Wow. That was impressive.
What's the financial incentive for real estate?
Well, I'll give you just one example, and you'll have to shut me up because I get too excited about this stuff. But one example is when Microsoft built that $8.3 billion new campus, and when they heard embodied carbon, what is that? That sounds important, doesn't it? Right? Microsoft let us tell the whole building industry in the Pacific Northwest, if you do not have an environmental product declaration for your recipe for cement, for concrete, you will not be able to bid on this project. Amazon is doing the same thing. Google is doing the same thing. Salesforce is doing the same thing. The tech sector is actually taking the lead on making demands like this.
Great.
And when you've got billions of dollars chasing contracts and chasing products, it makes a difference in the market.
Sure.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I want to kind of finish by telling you two more quick bullet points here about evidence. What is my evidence of change? For one thing, 5 years ago, in January of 2018, the Washington State Legislature, with some prompting from us, passed a law, or it wasn't a law, I guess it was part of the budget that gave the Carbon Leadership Forum some money to do a study on what was called Buy Clean legislation. Buy Clean legislation started in California a year before that. And Buy Clean legislation essentially said, if you're taking taxpayer dollars and you're using those dollars to buy construction materials to build a building, you have to make sure that every product has an EPD and you're using the lowest carbon footprint building materials available.
Wow.
5 years ago, they gave us money to start to do a survey, or not a survey, but rather a study of to conclude what would be an effective policy to make that happen and have it be a big impact. The following year, 4 years ago, the first time that law, the Buy Clean Washington law, was proposed in the legislature, and it did not make it out of committee. The second year, it did not make it out of committee. The third year, it did not make it out of committee. And the fourth year, it made it out of committee. And that law may be signed by the governor sometime in the next 2 to 3 days.
Oh,
From
wow.
And it's now called Buy Clean, Buy Fair, because it's not just about building materials, it's about environmental justice and the sizable impact that the construction, manufacture, and transportation of materials have on the especially low income and marginalized communities through which they pass on their way to a job site. So that's really important. Another big milestone was 2 years ago, the Biden administration, what's his name? Joe Biden, I guess. He signed an executive order called Federal Buy Clean. And Federal Buy Clean did the same thing at the national level, but he could do it. He didn't have to rely on on Congress to pass the law. He could just sign a piece of paper and it said, this is what's going to happen. But the Inflation Reduction Act had legislation that also provided money to support federal Buy Clean and national Buy Clean. So, for example, the GSA, the General Services Administration, got over $2 billion for clean construction projects. That money has now been allocated, and there are over 100 building projects that are being launched by the GSA that demand low carbon building materials. The Department of Transportation got hundreds of millions of dollars. I don't know these, it's somewhere close to $1 billion to pass on to infrastructure projects at the state level that require clean construction of roads and highways.
Good.
The EPA got something like $150 million to promote the development of environmental product declarations by companies for their products, and then to actually give large amounts of money to lots and lots and lots of companies to promote to help develop the way that the production publication of EPDs change the building industry and alter the market fundamentally. And finally, 5 years ago, I decided to host something that I called the Embodied Carbon, or the NGO. NGO means non-governmental organization or nonprofit organization. So the NGO roundtable on embodied carbon. And at first it was like 6 or 7 nonprofit organizations in the United States coming together every few months and just saying, well, if you're having a conference that weekend, I won't do it that weekend. I'll do it the other weekend. Or, maybe we could think about how we use the same terms to describe this problem. Or maybe we could share the same kinds of benchmarks or targets for how we're going to address the problem. So it was just kind of a high level discussion about, well, what is it that we could do if we were thinking and acting together instead of by ourselves? And a few years a few years down the line here, that those original 5 or 6 organizations have now grown into over 50, including everybody that you can think of or heard of, I think, in the building industry, even if you haven't been part of the building industry. The American Institute of Architects and the U.S. Green Building Council and Rocky Mountain Institute and Underwriters Laboratory, and on and on and on. And about right in the middle of the pandemic, for the first time, governmental organizations started showing up, and so we had the EPA showed up. I didn't invite them; they just showed up and joined the meeting.
Wow.
And then the Federal Emergency Management, what is it? FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency showed up. Administration showed up, right? And then the GSA showed up, and then the Department of Transportation, and then the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory showed up. And so we changed the name to the NGO/Government Roundtable on Embodied Carbon. And guess who is the newest member of the NGO Government Roundtable on Embodied Carbon? As of like a week and a half ago, it's the White House.
Nice.
The Council on Environmental Quality just joined the roundtable, and the Deputy Chief Sustainability Officer for the United States will be presenting at our next meeting on what federal Buy Clean is and how the entire federal government is mobilizing to support the radical reduction of embodied carbon across the country, not just in the federal government. So for me, this is just amazing. I mean, oh my God.
Yes.
How did all of it feels like magic, it really does. It feels like something amazing and inexplicable is happening. When I think about this, it's like getting back to what I started out talking about hope. What is hope, and what do we need hope for, and what's that all about? It's, a lot of people, when they talk about the climate challenge or the climate crisis, people talk about the need to be optimists instead of pessimists, right? It's like, if we could only see the world through rose-colored glass, and maybe we'd act as if there were a solution to the problem. In a way, it's, the metaphor that I like to think about it with is the metaphor of the glass, that's either half full or half empty. And everybody knows this metaphor, or this little story. But, the idea is, you see it, the glass, it's the same glass, the water's up to here. Is it half full? Well, if it's half full, you're an optimist, and that means, you can see positive possibilities in the world. And if you see that same glass and it's half full, you think, well, we're all screwed or whatever, it's not a happy scene out there, right? Well, I want to suggest that there's a third way of looking at that glass, which is much more appropriate to the world that we want to live in, which is a real utopia. The healthiest, maybe the best way to look at that glass is not as either an optimist or as a pessimist, but as a warrior. A warrior. So a warrior looks at that glass, and it's got water up to there, and a warrior looks at the glass and says, wow, look at that. There's a glass and it's got some water in it. I wonder who needs the water and how I can get it to them. So I think that for me, the bottom line is we don't need, and I'm going to tell you about the name of the book. I'm right in the middle of reading a book. And this book for me is it encapsulates the story that I'm trying to tell tonight. And I just heard about this book yesterday. I heard about it on a podcast that I was listening to. The podcast is MCJ Collective, My Climate Journey Collective, it stands for. And if you go to mcjcollective.com, and you can connect with this whole organization. It's a network of people around the world who are thinking about solutions to climate change.
Wow.
My Climate Journey, and you can join, it'll be about your climate journey as well. And it's a nonprofit organization, but they do a whole bunch of things that I never imagined before. And one of them is this podcast. It's a really excellent podcast. And they were interviewing the woman who was the editor of this book. And that's how I heard about the book. The title of the book is No More Fairy Tales, Stories to Save Our Planet. And it's 20 fiction stories, 25 fiction stories, short stories that address some aspect of the climate challenge and imagine some extraordinary solution that hasn't been thought of before or is kind of on the, maybe it's on the fringes somewhere, but it's part of the real world. There's real science behind it and real possibility behind it, but it's a short story, which is also about all of the potential and the disaster and all of the amazing things that could happen or might not happen or whatever. So it's just, I'm on story number 4 right now, and I really love this book.
And what's her name?
Her, gosh, I knew you were gonna ask that question. I don't remember.
It's okay. I mean, that's a unique.
We'll look it up.
It's on my phone. I can look it up.
We'll gather it later and include it in resources.
Anyway, so I'm just recommending that book for warriors. And I think that we're all warriors in this room.
I love it. That can be the book for our next book club.
So I guess the last thing that I want to say is, what is it that actually compels us? What is it that actually compels us to do things that matter? What's the fundamental drive that we have? And I have to say, I don't believe it's fear.
No.
I really don't. I don't think it's fear. I don't think it's a sense of looming disaster and desperation. I don't think it's about the way in which we think that we're all screwed and our children are screwed and the planet is screwed and we're just doomed. I don't think that's what it is. I think the fundamental motivation of every single person in this room and every single person in the world is love. I don't think it's a big idea. I don't think it's a complex idea. I do not think it's an acronym. I think it's love. It's what is it that we love? What is it that we love? We love our families. We love our neighbors, however we define that, whether they're literally right next door or whether they live in Afghanistan or Gaza or China or Russia or the Ukraine or wherever. We love our neighbors. We love our children. We love our children's children. We love the children of the children of the children of the children that we have. And we love other people's children. We don't just love our own children. And there is this spark of expansive love in every single one of us around the world. And not always is it recognized or nurtured, but it's there. And it is at the heart of who we are and how we act and what we do in the world. So for me, this term, embodied carbon, I just love the term. It's like, we are embodied carbon. It's not just a bookkeeping term. We are embodied, we are beings made of carbon. And everything in our relationship to the natural world and the creation itself is about the interaction of atoms of carbon with each other.
The image, love that.
Yes.
I mean,
And God's in the midst of it.
Well, that's the way the whole universe holds together.
So
So can you take some questions?
that's why I'm here.
And before you do that, I just want to say Elizabeth found the authors.
Oh, good, good.
So No More Fairy Tales by Kim Stanley Robinson.
Oh, my God.
Oh,
Paola Baka. Elizabeth, do you know how to pronounce that
So
name?
so there are
And
heavens,
25
no.
authors, right?
Well, maybe
Baki
this is
Vanupi, I
edited.
guess.
Yeah.
And Sarah
Okay.
Foster, yeah.
And Sarah Foster, yeah, so
Yeah.
these are the editors.
Yeah,
Yes, okay.
there are 20, I think there are 24 or 25 stories,
Okay.
all by different authors. And Kim Stanley
Stanley.
Robinson is probably the most well-known of them. And they took 3 of the stories that Kim wrote for that book
Yeah.
and put in this book as well, because they're good standards.
Well, and of
read
course,
his,
Kim Stanley,
what's his big book?
Ministry of the Future.
Yes, I just read that.
Yeah.
Not
Okay,
yeah, that's
So,
a hard book to
let's
read.
so, questions. So Elizabeth, did you have a question? No, okay.
It was Libby, I think.
Oh, thank you. There we go. All right. I think Libby had a question.
Yeah, I had a
Libby?
question. Yeah, I actually have 2 questions. Um, is there, I like to have things very concrete. Is there maybe it's another session or another meeting offline or whatever, but I would like to have you walk me through how this embodied carbon measurement is understood. So I think you said at one point it was a manufacturer of concrete has to include the amount of gas that they spent in the process of moving trucks
Yeah.
around or whatever. So to wrap my head around it, I'd like a little bit more of a technical run through at another time.
Or maybe you have something.
Yeah.
Well,
So, and that
really-
could be another. What?
There's a really, really good and fairly easy to understand explanation of all of this on our website. So if you go to carbonleadershipforum.org
Okay.
and there's a resources menu. And in the resources menu, you'll find several toolkits. So there's a toolkit for policymakers, a toolkit for architects, a toolkit for let's see, policymakers, architects,
Manufacturers.
well, no, there's not one for manufacturers yet. There's one for infrastructure. Actually, just yesterday, we published a new one on infrastructure. And each of those toolkits has an embodied carbon 101 section
Hmm.
that explains
Okay.
all of the basic details and has really great drawings and graphics to go along with it. And that's probably going to be a better way to help you understand it than a short answer from me.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I was looking for. Thank you. My other question is, I know that you know all about Project Drawdown
Yeah,
and how they're structured. So are you interfacing this with their work somehow?
yeah. Project Drawdown is a member of our NGO roundtable. And so they show up at every meeting and provide us a report. And, the idea of the roundtable is we all want to share a common collective specific understanding of the problem. We want to share specific solutions to the problem. We want to share terminology. We want to share benchmarks for how we, what a benchmark is essentially. How do you know that you're getting better? You got a place to start that everybody agrees. Yeah, that's the right place. And then you all have to agree on how we're going to get there and what are the specific things that we're going to do to interact with each other. The ECHO project was an outgrowth in some way of the roundtable that I was just talking about. All of those organizations are part of the roundtable.
And how often does your roundtable meet?
We meet every 3 months, and a typical meeting, the next one is in April. A typical meeting is over 20 organizations in 90 minutes. Every one of them gives a report on here's what we're up to, here's what we're doing. So it's typically not a major presentation with questions and answers. It's typically everybody reporting to everybody else. When the White House, when Maddie from the White House speaks in April, it's highly unusual. I'm going to give her 20 minutes.
So can
Great.
anyone join? Can anyone, are these
Yeah.
online? And
Well,
is it
the
open to
round
the
table,
public?
it's not open to the public.
Okay.
You need to be a representative of typically of
Right.
an NGO or a nonprofit or a government agency. But anybody can join the Carbon Leadership Forum just as a member and get the free newsletter,
Oh.
which I'm the
Okay.
editor of, so I know a lot about that.
And then,
So just go to the CLF website, carbonleadershipforum.org, and click on news and then newsletter and sign up right there.
okay, wonderful, thank you.
And when did you start being involved with this? I mean,
7 years ago.
yeah, 7 years ago.
7 years ago, yeah. So and I have to say, everybody else on our team, they're all architects and engineers, and they all have multiple degrees. And I've got a high school diploma that I'm very proud of. But, yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well-
leadership,
there
obviously,
you
communication,
Yeah.
right? So, so I just want to ask, and how does the public learn about this? Because voters, for instance,
right.
and just general public. So what is your group doing anything about messaging, or is someone else working
So-
on that?
I know that there are lots of other people who work
Yeah,
on
okay.
messaging and broad
Right.
communication.
Right,
We're not specifically. We try to be very, very targeted on the building industry and on building industry professionals, full-time professionals.
which,
But the Biden administration and the Democratic Party generally are paying a lot of attention to this. In some sense, what we hear from inside the administration is this is the number one domestic target. And what they talk about is job creation. They talk about economic transformation. They talk about the evolution of the economy in a way that is sustainable. And they never mention the term embodied carbon. But every time Biden or any of them talk about economic development, about infrastructure, about all of that, they're all talking about this stuff. And by the way, they've asked, the White House has asked us to provide training on embodied carbon, and to do that, Embodied Carbon 101 workshop that we do for all of the federal agencies. And there are two cross government, all of the major agencies in the federal government, they're in any way related to this topic. They get together on a monthly or a quarterly basis. There are two different groups of agencies. And Maddie, who's the Deputy Chief Sustainability Officer, hosts one, and another woman named Lauren, who's the Executive Director of the Council on Environmental Quality, hosts the other. So they're just incredibly happy that we're doing what we're doing, and we're really happy that they're doing what they're doing.
wow. So
Yeah.
Ruth,
So I'm interested in the idea that here's the building industry, but if you add to it fair, the whole concept of justice, all that, and you add it to the building industry, you've got quantum more power and collective caring and expression of love.
Right.
Does that make sense?
It totally does. And this is a really, really interesting question, because historically, environmental justice has just been about the local impact of manufacturing and transportation and construction on marginalized communities. The local impact, right? Historically, also, climate justice has been about the global impact
Yes.
of excess CO2 in the atmosphere on dramatic weather events, and increasing marginalization and the developing fragility of life in the global South and around the world, especially for marginalized populations and communities. So what's interesting to me up until now, conceptually, climate justice and environmental justice have been two completely different topics. What brings them together, the natural bridge between them, is embodied carbon. Because that's about both. It's about reducing the impact of excess CO2 in the atmosphere globally, at the same time that we pay deep attention to how things are made and how they're transported and how they're put together into things that we buy and use and live in, right? So that conceptual link is incredibly important. And there are folks in the environmental justice movement and in the climate justice movement who are beginning to pay attention to that. I still think that we're at the beginning of the kind of revolution in thinking that what your question asked is all about. But we're, for the Carbon Leadership Forum, that's incredibly important. We're very, very interested in that question.
Great to know.
Hey,
So, yeah, go ahead.
oh, no, I think,
Yeah. Yep.
I just said, how can you make this more tangible for us in terms of renewable energy? And the need for energy sources to decarbonize, like how does that relate back to the building industry?
Yeah, so the interesting thing is that you can't talk about the two forms of carbon emissions in abstract or in separation from each other. In order to really understand both problems, you have to understand the problem that they're part of, and that's the carbon balance. So, for example, what we refer to as life cycle assessment is an analysis of the entire carbon footprint of any material, of any product throughout its life cycle, right? And so the entire carbon footprint is both operational carbon, energy, and embodied carbon. So if all you're thinking about is energy, then you fail to understand that half the carbon emissions for any product comes in the form of emissions that are created before the product is purchased or used, right? If all you think about is embodied carbon, then you don't have a holistic or complete understanding of the product. And the specific tactics or strategies that building designers and developers and manufacturers use to address the complete carbon, the total carbon picture for that product, depends on having that holistic understanding. So that sounds too kind of abstract to me, what I just said. I guess, to try to make it a little bit more concrete, when you think about only embodied carbon, you may be missing opportunities to reduce operational carbon or energy. If you only think about energy, you may be missing an opportunity to reduce embodied carbon. And a really, really great, very literally concrete example of that is the Bullitt building here in Seattle, right? So the Bullitt Center was the very first living future building challenge created structure in the world. And it's a wonderful building. It's highly, highly efficient. It's completely self-sufficient in water and in, they, at least in the past, it's changed now, but they used to not have any excess sewage that went out of the building. They would recycle and repurpose it into nitrogen and a way to make things grow better inside the building. And they didn't use any water from outside the building. They just recycled everything. So, and it had an extremely low need for electrical energy to power the lights and the heating and all the rest of it. What was wrong with this picture is that the building is constructed with massive amounts of concrete, which included a lot of cement as a component of the concrete. And nobody paid any attention to that whatsoever at the time that the building was constructed.
And that was years ago.
And that was like, what, 14, 15 years ago, something like that. So today, you wouldn't build the Bullitt Center in the same way. You'd think, oh, well, what's the complete carbon picture for this building?
I like the idea that you said the most carbon efficient building is the one that's already made. And
Or the
we're-
one that you never tear down.
Yeah,
Right.
and we're in a 100-year-old cathedral and that we're trying to make more energy efficient. So
That was part of my pitch years ago when the Creation Care Committee was getting off the ground, and we went and visited, went and visited Steve Thomason and a couple of other folks. Remember that meeting? And we were talking about, well, it's really an amazing building. And it's a wonderful building, and it's a beautiful building. And it would make so much sense historically, culturally, spiritually, and materially to make it a much better building, make this a green building.
Thank you.
Okay. So I've got two different pieces here. One is from the Holy Island Prayer Book that I picked up in Iona, I believe, or Lindisfarne, one of those. And then a slight adaptation of the strategic planning. There's a little prayer on these bookmarks, which actually give out afterwards. So let us pray. Creator and Savior, we have exploited earth for our selfish ends, turned our backs on the cycles of life, and forgotten we are your stewards. Now soils become barren, air and water become unclean, species disappear, and humans are diminished. In penitence, we come to you. In dependence on the God of life, may we cherish the precious earth, the earth of the God of life, the earth of the Christ of love, the earth of the Spirit holy. In dependence on the God of life, may the earth be our bed of hope. Holy and ever-living God, creator of all things in heaven and earth, hear our prayers for this parish family and this ministry. Be present as we discern new ways in which you call each of us into the creation care ministry. Grant us all things necessary for our common life and bring us all to be of one heart and mind within your holy church through Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen.
Amen.